Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second talk this term. It's always lovely to have you all here. I'm Chris, I'm one of the co-founders, and I thought I'll give a quick introduction to who we are, what we do, while we wait for a couple more people. So, and that's for Stuart as well. So we were founded in 2020 to address growing concern over misinformation, anti-scientific thinking, conspiracy ideation, from a number of sectors and academic disciplines. And we really wanted to create a community of students who appreciate the importance of this effective and compassionate scientific messaging, and also to bring together, evidently existent multidisciplinary interests, bring the discussion together into understanding the nature and the scale of the problem, and also the ways we can tackle these issues, starting from the very top of the information chain, right here in Cambridge. We see that we are unique, that there aren't similar student initiatives across other UK universities, or indeed none that we found elsewhere. But we know the interest is not new. We know that it's more relevant than ever. And so while we will stand firm in our values in refuting the unsubstantiated or proven false, we're not interested in trying to qualify what is or isn't science. The bulk of our work is one of compassion, empowerment, and kind of educating one another, because we know as students we're in the peculiar position of having some knowledge while being some distance from fully fledged experts ourselves. We're really, really well placed in Cambridge to build bridges with future policymakers, teachers, clinicians, researchers, whatever. So yeah, we are very proud of our speakers event, and Stuart, having you here with us today is really, really lovely. And similarly, our audience love having you here. It's always great to see everyone. And while everyone is here, I just want to make sure that our upcoming 3 talks. Next Thursday, we have Kylie Sturgess, token skeptic, to talk to us about best practices in science and skeptical podcasting. And then following that, on the 9th, Joseph Wyszynski, professor of political science at the University of Miami, is going to talk to us about basically what popular and policy discussions of conspiracy theories get right and wrong. And then we have Caleb Lack, who is an award-winning educator, researcher, and author, like so many of our speakers. And he actually explores the very interesting topic of what underlies the skeptical philosophy, whether it is arrogance or humility of a very specific type. And the last thing we have this term is Surviving Misinformation Age by astronomist David Helfand. It will be really lovely to see all of you again in these events. And just to wrap up my bit, going forward, we certainly want to build a community with all of you. In case you haven't seen in the email, we're having a social next Thursday. On the same evening, we're having Kylie with us, and that will be in Robinson MCR. It'd be really nice to meet some of you face to face, and you'll find that later in the year there'll be opportunities to work with experts and communicate and create a series of workshops, probably setting up a conference. And basically our aim is to excite and involve as wide and as diverse a community as possible, and to build bridges across student societies, not-for-profit organizations, academics, professionals, and social media presences and the like. And we'd love you to be a part of that effort. And so, one last plug, that our committee applications are open. They've actually been very popular. So it is for that reason that I just want to make sure that everyone who has been interested in any way to get your name in before we start filling up those positions. So yes, lovely to have you with us today, Stuart. He has an award-winning book, Believing Magic: The Psychologist Superstition Explores Our Tendencies to believe superstitions, how effective they are, and whether they're ultimately helpful. It's great to have an expert of superstition and irrational behavior with us, because we've not really explored this before. And I really, really look forward to not only learning about the psychology of superstition, but the kind of more philosophical side of whether it might actually have any benefits. I look forward to hearing Stuart explore that, and I look forward to the Q&A at the end. Once again, the talk is recorded, and if you have any questions throughout the talk, please just stick them in the chat. So without further ado, Stuart, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be with you in this weird way that we are. I am in rainy Connecticut. I would much rather be in Cambridge now, but we'll do what we can. And I also want to say right up front that I am so excited about your organization. I hope it blossoms and spreads to lots of other campuses throughout the globe, because it is a really important topic. If anything, we seem to be, having much more pseudoscience these days than we were before, and that's not a good trend. So you are a good trend, and I'm happy to be a part of it. It sounds like you have other than me, you have an excellent series of speakers coming, and that's very exciting. So I will get started, and so I've given a number of talks, as you can imagine, over the plague in this kind of weird TV format, and I chose to do something a little bit different for you folks, just because it's a good thing to do. And so I've recently written a chapter on this topic, and so I thought I would share it with you. But how do people become superstitious? It's obvious that not everyone does, and so that's part of the reason why I chose this topic. Let's see if I can get it, if I can get things to work here. There we go. Okay, so I always start with a little bit of a meme. This is a popular meme lately. How it started, how it's going. Yarrow sticks and the I Ching were used for fortune telling and divination, several thousand years ago, and yet we still have crazy theories of codes. Things will improve. A long time ago, I published this book, as was mentioned, on the psychology of superstition. This is a little bit of the self-serving part of the show at the beginning, where I talk about my books and products. So I updated the book, and since 2016, I've been writing for Skeptical Inquirer magazine, which I hope you're all familiar with. It's a great, if I say so myself, a great publication. And it's been a wonderful pleasure for me to write a column in the magazine every month, and also online. I also just want to point out, I'm sure that many of you are also familiar, that there's a wonderful similar publication in the UK, which is online only. I'm sure that many on the call are familiar with it already, but I highly encourage you. Michael Marshall is the main editor, a terrific guy who's been doing this work for a long time, and other great people, Edward Ernst and lots of other people writing in the magazine. So just want to plug that. And most recently, I wrote a book just as the pandemic was coming to us. I wrote this book, which is a complete overview of the topic of superstition. I am a psychologist. I'm mostly interested in the psychology of superstition, but I was given the opportunity to write this little book in the Oxford very short introduction series, which covers everything from soup to nuts, history of superstition and so forth. And it was quite an honor. It was actually a challenging book to write, but I was very pleased with the outcome finally. So today, this talk is about how people become superstitious, and it is a preview of a chapter I wrote called Psychology and Learning in this forthcoming book, which is edited by Stephen Hupp and Richard Wiseman. Richard Wiseman is a name I think will be familiar to many of you. He's done a lot of work on the psychology of superstition also, and on luck and other things. He's sort of a celebrity and great guy. And Stephen Hupp is a developmental psychologist in the US. In fact, if I go back a couple of slides, that cover story on the Skeptical Inquirer was by Stephen Hupp. He's interested in pseudoscience as it applies to child psychology, and so he's done some great work, published a couple of books on the topic, and this is a forthcoming book from which today's talk comes. Okay, so the topic is superstition, and I wasn't the first person ever to write on this topic. Back in 1970, which it seems like a long time ago now, Gustav Jehoda, a psychologist, he's actually Austrian, but he spent the last part of his career in Scotland, and he came up with a classification system. Jehoda was one of the founders of cross-cultural psychology, and so he's an important figure in that sense of the psychology of different cultures. And he came up with the classification system for superstition that I've sort of borrowed. It seems to work in many contexts. And so he talks about socially shared superstitions. Those are the common ones that we all know. We learn them from our parents or from whomever, or just by breathing the air in a culture. You come up with this knowledge. He also talked about superstitions that were more elaborate, that were part of a cosmology or a worldview that had many more parts to it. I would put astrology in that category. And then finally, the category of personal superstitions that are your own, you seem to have come up with on your own, and you wouldn't necessarily tell someone else that they should try them. So these three are the sort of main categories, and I will talk a little bit. I was talking mostly about the first and the last, but a little bit about all of them today. And here's the overview of the talk itself. How we learn socially shared superstitions, the basic ones, the learning of personal superstitions, and then finally I will talk about the topic of whether they work or not, because if they were effective in some way, that would also be a way that they might be acquired, right? They're acquired because they actually do something, right? So I'll have something to say on all three of those topics today. I also want to first start by giving a definition of a superstition. We talked about different kinds, but what do we mean when we talk about a superstition? No one has really put out a standard definition, so I just put my own out and have used it. And basically, I consider a superstition to be a subset of paranormal beliefs. So paranormal beliefs are ones that don't adhere to science, that they are in conflict with our basic understanding of the natural world. But superstitions have the added feature that they are pragmatic, that they're aimed at a goal. They're either to bring good luck or to avoid bad luck. And so that's that. I also suggest that they should be culture fair. And this goes to the point of, the word superstition is not a nice word. Most people don't like to be called superstitious. You wouldn't say, hello, my name is Stuart, and I'm superstitious. You wouldn't lead with that. It would not be a good way to make friends and influence people. So it is, and in the past, it's been used as a label to denigrate other religions and other belief systems. So my feeling is, since that negative feature is still there, that the best thing we should do is to make sure that we apply it fairly. So I wouldn't apply it to someone who comes from a culture that hasn't adopted Western science yet, and so therefore they, quote, don't know any better than to believe what they believe. I similarly would give children a little bit of an excuse, because they're not yet fully inculcated into the cause and effect relationships and how they work in the natural world. So once they get to be adults, if they still think that stepping on a crack will break their mother's back, then that's a superstition, and we'll call it that. So that's a basic definition. And so now I'd like to start with this. Can you identify this bird? And if so, do you have a feeling about it? I think this, I have been interviewed, I'm an American, okay? I've been raised my entire life in the US. I've been interviewed by a number of British commentators and journalists, and they frequently bring Mr. Magpie up in conversation quite often. And of course, I think it's sort of lovely that it stems from this nursery rhyme. And I guess the problem is if you see only one, right? In some cases, I've heard that people are afraid of odd numbers of magpies. But I don't understand that, because I think, there's nothing wrong with a girl. But it's a lovely nursery rhyme and interesting superstition that appears to affect a number of people. In your country, in the UK, the interesting thing is that it's nothing here. It's hard, we never have a problem with this, for a particularly obvious reason. There aren't many magpies over here. So the bird is not available to us to have the superstition, at least not in enough quantities. And so I find this fascinating. It's another example of the cultural differences with respect to superstitions. This may be hard to read, but if you can read it, this is a 2007 poll that was done in the UK. And the absolute, at least of these, this may not be all of the questions, but at least among this set of questions, the absolute most endorsed item is the magpie. And the question is, do you think or do anything special if you are alone and you see a magpie? The alone part is important, right? Because if other people are around, you might be embarrassed and you wouldn't do anything. You'd be intimidated. But 25% said yes, and I thought that was quite amazing. So in the US, of course, this question wouldn't even be realistic. So that's an interesting thing. And it's about 22% said they consider themselves to be superstitious, but because superstition is the taboo, undoubtedly that's a fairly substantial underestimate of the truth. I'm sure that many more people are superstitious than that. So, okay. So how do we get these socially shared? This has not been widely studied, but it seems very obvious that we get them from the people around us as we're growing up. Very much the analogy to learning religion or acquiring religion is fairly close, not with some exceptions, but it is obvious that most children grow up in the religion of their parents, at least initially. You may change later, but when you change, the data suggests that when you change to a religion that is similar, but not the same as your parents. So with similar sort of practices, in most people do. Obviously, there are exceptions, and so parents are the main movers on this, and in some cases, obviously, when it comes to the socially shared, the common superstitions, black cats, 13 magpies, you learn those almost without knowing that you're learning it. It's just as part of your cultural knowledge. The question is whether your parents actually do something about it, and if they actually act on those superstitions, then you're much more likely to acquire the same sort of patterns. There are some well-known demographic differences in terms of believers, and women in general are, for these socially shared superstitions, are more likely to believe. Young adults, your own age group, is interestingly slightly more likely to believe, and people become less superstitious as they age. And then there are humanities students in the humanities and the arts are more likely among university students to be superstitious naturally than you would imagine in the sciences or in psychology, for example. So the difference here is that with respect to religion is that religion, of course, obviously has these big institutions that reinforce all of the belief systems that are associated with them. And for the most part, the simple superstitions that we learn of, like magpies, there is no institution out there reinforcing your fear of Mr. Magpie. So that's the difference. And but nonetheless, this is likely to be our explanation for why people acquire these socially shared ones. It's also, noteworthy, I've mentioned it a little bit already, but that there are these wide cultural differences in certain kinds of superstition. So not only did I not acquire the magpie superstition growing up in the United States, but I growing up in the middle of this country as a sort of a default Protestant, I'd never heard of the evil eye either. I'd actually written my book on superstition before I heard about it. And yet this is a superstition that is widely believed in huge areas of the globe. It's believed in South Asia, the Middle East, parts of continental Europe in particular, and also South America. But I just was in this little pocket where it wasn't a thing. Now, I think today, most people are becoming more aware of it because the evil eye jewelry has become very popular. The highly controversial personality, Meghan Markle, has been seen wearing evil eye jewelry. So there's a commercial aspect to this particular superstition, but it's what's fascinating, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it today, but what's fascinating is how differently it is used and manifests itself in different places. It's a different in South Asia, the evil eye is dealt with in a very different way than, for example, in Italy, and then there's a whole other. There are different sets of jewelry in different places, Turkey versus the Middle East, and Hamsas versus Nazars. It's a fascinating, it's quite an amazing, long books have been written on nothing but the evil eye, multi-volume books. So anyway, also interesting that numbers are frequently the source of superstitions. Their arbitrariness means that things can be projected onto them. And those also differ widely depending upon where you are. 7 and 13 are the lucky and unlucky numbers, mostly in the West, but 8 and 4 in Asia, and strangely 17 in Italy is an unlucky number. So you can see the way in which culture, language, and upbringing are affecting these superstitions. I also feel obligated to point out that there is a profit motive involved here. So getting rid of these superstitions is going to be difficult if people can actually make money off of them. And so astrology, for example, is a huge business. Online astrologers, it's very big in India, but all over it's a thing. And there's lots of money being made on it. Evil eye jewelry, I told you already, has become sort of fashionable now, and other charms and so forth. And then in the growing Chinese economy and the pervasiveness of commerce in that area, they have a lot of superstitions that are visible in the marketplace. So one of them is numbers, and so this is actually over here a phone number from a sushi place in New Jersey in the United States, And that 888 number on their phone number, that's going to say something to a certain audience. That's going to resonate with a certain audience, and they're going to feel good about dialing that number. Homeopathy, you should probably have a whole speaker. You should probably get Edzard Ernst to come and speak to you about that topic. It's huge in the UK, I know. Prince Charles is into it, unfortunately, and doing all sorts of damage. But anyway, there's money there as well, and it's also popular in the US. Okay, I'm going to move on to personal superstitions now, and so. This is a slightly different thing. And as I said before, these are superstitions that are unique to the person. Usually it's your own thing that you keep close to you. Typically acquired by trial and error, although probably not exclusively. But it's also, we have to acknowledge that, we're talking about human beings here. And so, even if you found something that seems to have a relationship to an outcome, unless you're open to superstition based on your upbringing, and it's sort of a live hypothesis for you, it's not likely to stick. It's the person who feels superstitious to begin with, and finds something. I throw this in here as some examples of famous personal superstitions. Taylor Swift was born on December 13th. And so she actually believes that the number 13 is lucky for her. Her Twitter handle is Taylor Swift 13, I believe. And so she has sometimes put it on. I mean, this is a socially shared superstition that for her personally is positive. I don't think there's any evidence that it's good luck either, right? If we're scientific about it, but I kind of think she's doing a good thing by demystifying an otherwise scary number. And so in that sense, it's a positive example. You may recognize the basketball player over there as the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, who has an election day superstition. He must play basketball, a pickup basketball game on election days. And there's a whole story about how he established that. And to his credit, biography, he does refer to it. Superstitions don't admit to it, but he did. And then I don't know if you are a tennis fan at all, but the guy at the bottom who has all these long sequences of superstitions that are frequently delay the game and everything. He claims he's not superstitious. He says it's just a ritual or something that he does. But those water bottles he's adjusting there, one of them has cold water in it and one has warm water in it, or room temperature. He's really out there. So the beginnings of this whole line of research stem from B.F. Skinner, the American behavior psychologist, who his most famous experiment involved pigeons like this guy in a chamber where the pigeon didn't have to do anything. The pigeon was hungry to begin with, but every 15 seconds or so, you may be able to see a hopper, a little device on the lower right side of the chamber this guy's in, that has grain in it that the bird could eat. And every 15 seconds or so, the hopper would move up and he could eat for a little bit, maybe just 2 or 3 seconds, and then it would go away. And every 15 seconds, this would repeat. The bird didn't have to do anything except sit there and wait for the food if they wanted to. But the birds didn't just wait. By accident, or so Skinner thought, certain behaviors that the birds were doing, pigeons are pretty active when they're in these boxes, would get reinforced, and the birds would do them over and over again. So one bird, for example, bobbed its head up and down repeatedly. Another bird pecked at the bottom of the chamber. Another spun around in a circle. So they all had these, unique things that they did. And he recognized this as an analogy, at least, to human superstition. And that was sort of the beginning of the psychology of superstition as it's studied. I should point out that Skinner's experiment, let me go back for 1 second. Skinner's experiment was criticized, and a number of researchers thought that he wasn't actually seeing learned behavior, but that they were doing some kind of instinctive behavior because of the presence of food nearby. So there, as is the case in science, there was a controversy, and it may or may not be exactly the way Skinner saw it initially. But what is clear is that subsequent experiments with humans using similar paradigms have shown similar results. So instincts are less likely to be influential with humans than they would be with a pigeon, for example. And so I still think he was on to something. And here is an example of a human experiment that I did actually many years ago. It's written up in Believing in Magic, and also it will be in this chapter, forthcoming chapter. But this was a simple computer game where college students were placed in front of a computer with just 2 buttons to push. One button would bring the circle down 1 spot from its starting point in the upper left, and the other button would move it 1 to the right. And they weren't told how it worked. They were just told, go in there, press your buttons, and try to make points. And what happened was that when you got to the end of, if you got to the lower right-hand corner, you would earn a point. So any, combination of 4 on one key and 4 on the other key would do it. Any 5th press on a key would knock you off the board, and it would just start over again, no point. And when it was straightforward, every single trip through got a point. Generally people figured it out and knew how to do it. When we made the change of having only every 50% of trips through the maze gets a point, and made those random, made it a random 50%, suddenly strange things happened. The students who were working on it came up with strange patterns and ideas about how it had to work. One student said, you have to press the keys very slowly, and if you press too hard, it goes, and you don't get a point. Others had elaborate patterns through the maze that they felt were important, sequences of several patterns, and so forth. So it showed how uncertainty, the randomness of the outcome, was really engendering some interesting superstitions. I wasn't the first one to do this kind of research, but it was fun to do, and it led me actually on this path of studying superstition. So is it superstition? Well, Skinner's had his critics with respect to the pigeon experiment, but something very much like superstition has been shown in several experiments with both children, human children, and adults, and it does seem to work in these contexts where there is random reinforcement. But it also, we have to acknowledge that we're talking about human beings who can think, and so there is always cognition involved. There's some kind of problem-solving thing going on there. And for a superstition to be a real superstition, a personal superstition, as I said before, you probably have to be open to the idea that something magical is going on between you and the thing you're hoping for. Okay, so now the third topic, which is, can superstitions actually help? And this too might be an incentive for people to learn superstition. So if it did help, how would that be? How would that work? Well, it would not be a magical effect. I think we on this call, most of us would agree that Barack Obama's playing basketball really didn't get him to win the election. It was something else. And especially it's also true that if we're trying to think that the superstition is going to help you in a random activity, something where there's no human intervention at all, like playing dice, roulette, the lottery, the weather, the stock market, obviously there can't be a cause and effect relationship there. But the open question is about skilled activities where there is some skill involved. Could doing a superstition prior to playing in a soccer match or football, as you call it, or doing a business or school presentation, or performing in the theater, something like this. Could that actually help? And the mechanism, the causal chain is there at the bottom of the slide. You would do the superstition, it would have a psychological benefit on you, and it would lead to better performance. So this for the longest time was an open question, hadn't been studied. And then finally, a group of researchers at the University of Cologne did what became a very famous study, you may have heard of it, called the golf ball study. And it came to be known as the golf ball study. They did several other experiments as well, but this was one, a very simple idea. They brought people into the laboratory, individuals, one at a time, and they asked them to putt a golf ball into a cup across a carpet. And they had it lined up a certain distance so that it would be reasonable, possible to get it in. And they randomly assigned people to one of two groups. In one group, they just said, this is the ball people have been using today. And in the other group, they said, this ball has been lucky today, right? That's all. Subtle, simple intervention. Lo and behold, the people in the lucky ball group got more balls in the cup, significantly more. They did a t-test. And then the people who didn't have the lucky ball intervention. So this made a lot of noise, and I actually wrote about it in my book. And obviously it seems plausible, right, that this could work. And they had to determine that 80% of their participants believed in luck to begin with. So it was a possibility, and it seemed to work. Well, not so fast. So yes, these were the results. I've already told you that's that. But another group came along. Some of you may have heard that psychology and some other disciplines have had what we call a replication crisis. And so there's been a lot of emphasis on trying to reproduce published results in other people's labs and so forth. And embarrassingly, we found that some classic experiments can't be redone, and there obviously our faith in them has plummeted. Well, there's been quite a rash of people wanting to replicate studies, and because this one got such a splash in the publicity and so forth, I think these people at Dominican University in the US decided to do a replication. They communicated with the German researchers to make sure that they were doing it exactly as they had done. This was a posted study, so it was pre-registered. It was a larger sample. It was a much stronger study. Same golf ball intervention. Sadly, no effect. No effect, no significant difference between the two groups. They determined that their participants had a similar level of belief in luck. They even tried the intervention a second time, with an even more dramatic sort of suggestion that this was a lucky ball. Still didn't work. So we're left, and this is sort of it. As far as simple superstitions and whether they work or not in this psychological way, this is where we are. So we have kind of a murky result. It's really unclear. It's plausible. It makes sense, but the evidence is not solid yet. So we're left. And unfortunately, this study came out after I'd done the second edition of my book. So I would have written it a little differently if it had been out. Okay. Yes. Frowny face there, sadly. Okay, but I'll end on a slightly more positive note, although this too is quirky in a way. So there's been interesting research recently on topic of rituals, this being longer series of actions, and whether or not they would affect performance. And this is a study that is pretty clever. This is not the only study on this. There have been several now. So I'm beginning to feel more confident about the results with respect to rituals. But this is a study in which people were brought into the laboratory, and only when they arrived to do their laboratory volunteer work were they told that they were going to be required to sing a song in front of strangers, right? And the song was "Don't Stop Believin' by Journey." which is a big arena rock song, which you may not remember because you're too young. Anyway, other participants were brought in and were told that they had to perform timed math problems, which for most people creates anxiety. And they only learned that when they arrived. But they then implemented a ritual intervention in which they asked people to perform a ritual prior to their performance, right? And their definition of a ritual had these components to it. It has to be a rigid and repetitive sort of activity, a string of activities. It had to include some symbolic meaning. It doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to be explicitly superstitious, but some symbolic aspect to it. And it can't be directly related to the goal. So therefore, like practicing your singing can't be a ritual. That's practice. And so those were the three features that they had. This is one of the rituals that they had people do. They said, draw a picture of how you're feeling right now. They gave them pencil and paper. Sprinkle salt on the drawing. I assume they provided the salt. Count up to 5 out loud. Crinkle up the paper and throw the paper in the trash, right? So this is all happening just before they're about to sing in front of an audience or perform these math problems. And for some people had this and others did nothing or just sat for an equivalent period of time, didn't do this ritual. And the ritual did help. And they were able to measure anxiety as the person was performing, as well as count the outcome. In the singing task, they apparently had a karaoke machine that automatically scores your singing. I don't know how it's done actually, but that was their dependent variable. That it was the number of singing errors that the person made while singing Don't Stop Believing. So they were able to establish, and in subsequent studies have established a sort of a causal chain. It appears to be that the ritual reduces anxiety, and based on that reduced anxiety, increases performance. So the conclusions were, and this is sort of where I'm ending this talk, but that rituals have the ability to do that, and they do seem to affect performance, but the rituals need not be superstitious. If you have a superstitious ritual that you do, many athletes do before they go into a match, they do a sequence of things. And if they believe that it's a magical effect, then that's a superstition. But it's not the superstition, at least we don't have any evidence that's the actual superstitious belief that is doing it. It is simply the ritual that you're performing. And it could be superstitious, it could be religious, it could be secular, completely just your personal ritual. But the evidence suggests that the rituals like this, sequences of behaviors like this, do help. And so that's the best we can do on that. It's not pseudoscientific in my view, but it's an interesting outcome. And so I think yes, we can conclude that certainly superstitions have immediate psychological benefits. People wouldn't do them if they made them feel worse. They do make people feel better. It's plausible that a simple superstition like believing in a lucky ball could have an effect, but the evidence is bad for that at the moment. The evidence is stronger for rituals, for these longer sequences of behavior. I think that's it. How did I do on time?
You did excellently. Thank you so much. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions so far? Thank you so much for a lovely talk. Trias, go for it.
Thanks, Stuart. That was really fascinating. I had a question. So, do you think that sort of technology and the internet has increased or decreased superstition levels? So, like, my thinking is that you have the increase because of all the celebrities and that kind of the spread, but then you also have the decrease because people can actually like look up whether their superstition is nonsense from a scientific standpoint. So do you think which way do you think it's sort of pulled?
I tend to think that, unfortunately, that the influence is more negative than positive. I think part of it is simply that you can get exposed to many more superstitions. I mean, my social isolation in the Midwest of the United States is less possible today than when I was growing up. So you would probably come into contact with more superstitions and more people believing and so forth. And of course, that occurs sort of passively. You're just going to get exposed to it. And the checking activity that we hope everyone does it requires a bit more effort. You have to think about it and say, wait a second, is this real or not? And so although the internet is wonderful for being able to check on lots of things and test, and we hope your organization and others will get that habit going for people. But my tendency, I think, just as a armchair observer, would be that things are going in the wrong direction because of the internet.
Yeah, thanks. That's what I suspected. I had a sort of connected follow-up, and like my question was about the spread of superstition compared to the spread of other sort of forms of misinformation or disinformation. So we know that things like sort of anti-vax or conspiracy theories spread inherently because people think they're true. But with superstitions, you mentioned that there's also a kind of stigma where you don't want to be labeled as superstitious. So do you think this kind of has a difference in the way they spread through, like, even through generations or even like through populations?
Yeah, I think there is a difference there. I mean, the conspiracy theories and some of the things that we're dealing with today are popular beliefs, and people seem to bond over the fact that they share that belief with people. And of course, on the internet, you can find those people no matter where they are in the world. In the case of superstition, there isn't a church of superstition or a political party of superstition in the same sense. There are family and cultural, forces at work. And there's also, again, the reward of being superstitious is not a bonding with a large group, but it's the idea that it might help you personally. It has that sort of pragmatic, personal aspect to it. The number 13 is out there, but when you have to personally deal with it is when this superstition is going to come up. And so it's different in that respect. And so, in that sense, I guess it's probably a good thing that these other things, I mean, I am amazed at how anti-vax ideas have spread so rapidly and widely in the last couple of years due to COVID. I mean, they were always out there, right, in smaller groups, both in both our countries, and with respect to the fake Wakefield studies and the idea of autism and so forth. But now, because of the group bonding aspect of it, and it's become a uniform that people wear, it is just really taken off. Mostly, basic superstitions don't have that feature, not yet at least. And so I suppose we can take some solace in that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a question. So I think at the very beginning of the talk, you actually try to define parameters of superstition. Yeah. And I really liked that. And you touched on culture being a thing, and also children, as part of, at some point there is a cutoff, I presume. I'm interested in how you think we can think about where we draw a line between superstition and tradition, and whether they are necessarily tied together.
Right. No, it's a great question. And I don't know whether this is exactly where you were going, but many of the things that we would call a superstition, even things that are part of religious belief, right, are also part of a cultural tradition, that you grew up in. They can be an expression of you as a member of a group, not unlike the conspiracy theory thing, but but of a group that you grew up in that is meaningful to you. And so I am, probably some of my more skeptical friends would not agree with me, but I think that there are many things that people do that are not purely scientific, that they do for cultural or personal reasons because it's an expression of who they are, right? And I don't mean that in a combative way. I mean it in a self, fulfilling way. And so as long as while you're doing that, you still believe in science and you still believe in evidence and so forth. I think those kinds of things are reasonable, and maybe even important in terms of feeling connected to your past, to people in your life, that the people you grew up with. So it is an interesting line drawing exercise with respect to that. I also get people saying, that being culturally fair is not right, that we should just call those other people superstitious and that's that. I'm not in that group. I don't think that's an effective strategy, so I don't go for that.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think personally, I am with you. We have had Professor Edza Ernst with us before, and I think very much so. He probably belongs in what you said as one of your more skeptical friends who might. I'm very glad we appreciate the value of culture, and it is hard to draw the line. I really see that, and I guess alternative medicine really does test that line because it actually has an effect, either by omission or by choice. So another question I had, and other people, if you have a question, please do raise your hand or let me know. The operant superstition experiment you said, has anyone tried it on babies?
Oh, not infants, no, that I'm aware of. That would be an interesting thing. Pre-languaged infants, that would be kind of interesting to see. It's not easy to do experiments with them. They don't behave very well. But it has been done with smaller, like 3-4, preschool age children. And a couple of studies done out in Kansas mounted a clown face on the wall, and the clown would periodically, much like Skinner's experiment, would periodically dispense marbles out of its mouth. And when the kid got the marbles, they would collect the marbles in a jar, and they were told that at the end of the experiment, they could trade those in for a toy or something, right? And in that, there were it's very much like the pigeon experiment. There was a period of time that you had to wait, and not every kid did it, right? Not every kid did it. Some of them just sat there and waited, right? But some of the kids would, sing a song. They would touch the nose of the clown. They would dance. So they did create sorts of behavior that were similar to the pigeons in that sense. Some of them did, at least. And so that's as close as we've come with young children, is to do it that way.
No, I'm very glad this experiment exists, and I guess the point is to kind of corroborate it with cognitive developmental stages. And
yes.
and while we're on that, I guess is there more research or anything that you're aware of, or do you have a view on at what age that we might learn these superstitions, or I guess traditions, and it's probably the same kind of cognitive pathway, or if we do, or perhaps is there a view on whether these things could be innate, or to what extent they could be?
Well, I mean, obviously what is innate, and we are very fortunate for it, is an ability to determine cause and effect relationships, to respond to consequences that we see in the world of our actions. And you know, we are the best at that of all the species. I don't think I'm overstating it when I say that. But we also see relationships, cause and effect relationships, that aren't really there. And there may be some adaptive value of that actually in some circumstances. Better to be safe than sorry in some cases, right? But so I think that, you know, the ability, whether superstition is innate or not, I'm not convinced of that, but I'm convinced that the ability to acquire both reasonable behavior and superstitious behavior is definitely innate, and for the most part we're pretty good about our use of it, of that ability to learn from experience, but sometimes we get off, you know, a little bit. And you know, there are also larger issues of meaning and need and fear of death and so forth that I didn't get into today, but obviously when it comes to superstition, those things apply as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. So if no one else has any other questions, I think we are in a very good place to wrap up. It's just about 6 o'clock, and I don't know, is there anything else you would like to share with us, Stuart?
Not really. I think we've covered it. If there aren't any other questions, then that's fine. I just want to say again that I applaud you all for starting this organization, and hope that you have great success with it. And as I say, if I were at some other university, I would want to make an organization like yours.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot, and we're very happy to have you here, and for you to join our lovely line of speakers. And we talked about this briefly earlier. If you ever do come to Cambridge, do let us know.
I will look you up. No, I love Cambridge and would love to come back. It's a wonderful place. So I will let you know if that happens.
Okay, thank you so much. So everyone, thank you very much for coming. I'm just putting a link in the chat. If you'd like to give us a little bit of feedback, we'd love to see any thoughts that you've had. And yeah, thank you. There's some thank yous in the chat coming through. There's been some clappy hands earlier. We're used to it. Thank you very much. Do keep an eye out for our forthcoming events. Do think about coming to our social. Do think about applying to our committee. Would love to see you. And all the very best to everyone. Is anything else anyone else would like to say?
Thank you. Thank everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.